My millionaire grandfather thought he had control over every detail of his perfect life, until the day a quiet young maid walked through the front gates of his mansion. She wasn't glamorous, she didn't come from a famous agency, and yet there was something about her presence that unsettled everything. No one knew her story, not even him, but behind her silent eyes, she carried a truth powerful enough to collapse generations of secrets and rewrite everything we believed about our family. What started as a simple job quickly turned into the unraveling of a legacy, because that maid wasn't just any maid. She was blood. Enjoy the story. The morning she arrived, the house staff whispered behind closed doors. They weren't used to seeing someone like her, young, modestly dressed, and carrying nothing but a small, worn leather bag. She didn't speak much, but her eyes scanned every detail of the house as if she'd been there before. My grandfather barely acknowledged her presence at first. To him, she was just another name on a payroll. But I remember watching him pause for a moment longer than usual when she served his tea. Something in her face, it stopped him, like a memory clawing its way out of the past, begging to be recognized. But he blinked, took a sip, and carried on with his day, never realizing that his entire world had just changed. At first, she kept to herself. She worked hard, never complained, never missed a task. But what struck me most was how she moved through the mansion, not like a stranger, but like someone who belonged. I saw her pause near the old family portraits hanging in the east hallway, her eyes fixed on one in particular, a photo of my grandfather as a much younger man, standing next to a woman I didn't recognize. I asked her if something was wrong. She smiled gently and said, "I'm just learning." I didn't understand what she meant then, but it haunted me, those words, that look. It was as if she already knew the truth and was simply waiting for the right moment to let it surface. That moment came unexpectedly. One evening, while cleaning the library, she found a drawer left slightly open, one my grandfather kept locked for decades. Inside was a stack of letters, tied with a red ribbon, old and yellowed with time. I walked in just as she held one in her hand, frozen. Her eyes were filled with tears. "Do you know what this is?" she whispered. I shook my head. She handed me the letter. It was addressed to my grandfather, from a woman named Elena. And that's when everything changed. The girl wasn't hired by accident. She had come here for a reason. Not revenge, not money, but truth. And my grandfather was about to face the one secret he buried so deep. He thought it would never rise again. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the hallway outside the library, the letter still trembling in my hands. The name Elena felt foreign, yet somehow familiar. I had never heard my grandfather speak of her, not once, and that alone was suspicious. The maid, her name was Sophia, remained quiet the rest of the evening, returning to her quarters as if nothing had happened. But I knew something had cracked open in her. I saw it in the way she lingered near the photo again before going to bed, in the way her hands gently brushed the frame, almost like she was saying hello or goodbye. My heart raced with questions. Who was Elena? Why had she written so many letters? And most of all, what did Sophia already know that none of us did? The next morning I did something reckless. I went into my grandfather's study, while he was out walking in the garden. I placed the letter on his desk, just the top one, the first in the stack, and left without a word. I didn't know how he would react, but I needed to know the truth. That afternoon, the house went strangely quiet. No music playing from the dining room speakers, no staff rushing through the halls, just silence. When I found him in the library, later that evening, he was sitting in his old leather chair, the letter clutched in his hand, tears silently rolling down his face. "She had my eyes," he said softly. "I should have known the moment I saw her." My stomach dropped. "Who?" I asked. But I already knew. He looked up at me, voice cracking. "Sophia, she's my daughter." Everything stopped. For a moment, the weight of decades came crashing down in that single breath. My grandfather, a man who built empires, commanded rooms with his presence, and never once admitted a mistake, sat there broken, not by scandal, not by loss of fortune, but by the realization that he had a child he never knew, and she had been under his roof for weeks. I was young, foolish, he confessed. I loved Elena, but I was afraid. Afraid of what my family would say, afraid it would ruin everything. He shook his head, as if trying to erase the past by sheer force of will. I thought she'd moved on. I thought it was all gone, but it wasn't. Sophia had returned, not to punish, but to understand. She came with the truth. And now, It was his turn to face it. The following days in the mansion felt like walking through a cloud of silence and tension. My grandfather, who used to run board meetings with a voice like thunder, suddenly became quiet, almost fragile. He avoided Sophia, not out of resentment, but out of fear. Fear that he wouldn't be able to face what he had lost. Meanwhile, Sophia kept working as if nothing had changed. She didn't demand attention, didn't reveal the truth to anyone else. But every time she walked past him, he would steal a glance full of regret, recognition, and a silent plea for forgiveness. He had spent a lifetime building walls so high no one could climb them, and now, one letter had cracked it all wide open. One afternoon, I found him in his study, staring at a photo of Alina, one I had never seen before. It was tucked behind his bookshelf, like a secret even he didn't want to face. He looked up as I entered. "She wrote to me for years," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "Begged me to see her, to meet Sophia, but I ignored them all. Told myself it was better that way." His hands trembled. "Do you know what it's like to realize you've missed every birthday, every first word, every scraped knee? One missed it all." There was no anger in his tone, only heartbreak. I asked him what he would do now. He looked out the window, where Sophia was tending to the roses, and said, Maybe I can still be something. A father, late, but not absent." That night, he asked for her at dinner. It was the first time he had ever done that. The table was set in the grand dining room, chandeliers glowing above, yet the atmosphere was intimate, fragile. When Sophia walked in, her eyes met his, and for the first time, he didn't look away. He stood up, slowly, and with a voice shaking, like a man relearning how to speak from the heart. He said, "I know what you are to me now, and I don't expect forgiveness. But if there's even the smallest part of you that wants to know who I am, I'm here, for as long as I have left." There were no grand speeches, no movie-like reconciliation, just two souls, one broken by guilt, the other weathered by silence, finally sitting at the same table, sharing not food, but truth. And that was the beginning of everything. From that night forward, something began to shift slowly, like winter giving way to spring. My grandfather didn't suddenly become a different man, but he began to try. For the first time in decades, he broke his rigid routines. He started waking up earlier just to have coffee where Sophia liked to sit in the garden. He asked questions, real ones, about her life, her childhood, her dreams. And although her answers were careful at first, you could see the walls inside her begin to fall brick by brick. She wasn't expecting a miracle. She had lived most of her life without a father. But to see this powerful man, the same man who once turned his back on the truth, now trying to rebuild something from the ruins, that meant everything. I remember a particular moment that stays with me to this day. It was a Sunday afternoon. The house was quiet. I passed by the drawing room and saw Sophia seated at the piano, her fingers gently moving over the keys. My grandfather stood beside her, watching, not correcting, not commanding, just watching. He didn't say a word, he just placed a hand on her shoulder. She looked up, startled at first, then smiled. It was the first genuine smile I'd ever seen pass between them. That small touch carried more weight than 100 apologies. In that moment, I realized forgiveness doesn't always come in grand gestures. Sometimes it's in shared silence. Sometimes it's in the way someone chooses to stay present, day after day, even when it's uncomfortable. Weeks passed. The staff began to notice too. Whispers in the kitchen were replaced by soft smiles. The house, once cold and calculated, now felt human. My grandfather even called the family lawyer and added Sophia to the guest list for the annual foundation gala, something unheard of for any staff member. But when asked, he simply said, "She's not staff, she's family." That word family echoed like a thunderclap across generations. The same man who once buried letters out of fear was now introducing his long-lost daughter to the world. And as Sophia stood beside him that evening, in a simple dress with her mother's locket around her neck, the entire room saw it. The same eyes, the same posture, the unmistakable bond. She was no longer just the maid. She was home. But as with all things in life, healing is not a straight path, and not everyone in the family embraced this sudden revelation. Whispers spread among distant relatives, the kind who never cared to visit until inheritance became a topic. Some accused her of manipulation. Others questioned the timing. "Why now?" they murmured. "Why, after all these years?" But my grandfather, for once in his life, didn't bend to the pressure. At a private family dinner, he stood up, glass in hand, and with the same commanding voice that once ruled boardrooms, he declared, "Blood is not defined by convenience, it's defined by truth. And Sophia is my daughter." No further discussion. Silence followed, thick and uncomfortable, but no one dared challenge him. Not this time. Sophia, on the other hand, carried herself with quiet dignity. She never retaliated, never raised her voice. She knew her story would shake the foundation of a carefully curated legacy, but she didn't come for revenge, she came for closure. And slowly, even the coldest hearts began to thaw. I watched uncles who once avoided her now invite her into conversations. I saw cousins ask about her life, her work, her interests. It wasn't overnight, but it was real. And my grandfather, he changed too. He became softer, slower, but wiser. He started speaking about his past, not with pride, but with accountability. He didn't try to rewrite history. He simply acknowledged it, and in doing so, gave Sophia something she'd never had. A father who finally showed up. One evening, not long after Sophia's birthday, my grandfather handed her a gift. It wasn't expensive, at least not by his standards, just a small wooden box. Inside it was a silver bracelet. But what caught my eye was the inscription, "I missed your first steps, but I won't miss the rest." Sophia's hands trembled as she held it. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she didn't cry. Instead, she placed the bracelet on her wrist, then leaned in and kissed him gently on the cheek. That gesture, so simple, said more than words ever could. It wasn't forgiveness in its entirety, but it was the beginning of peace, not just between a father and a daughter, but between a man and his past. And somehow, it made all of us believe, maybe broken things really can be made whole again. The months that followed became a kind of second life for my grandfather, not in the sense of youth regained, but in the grace of redemption finally lived. He began spending less time in his office and more time in the garden, often walking side by side with Sophia, asking questions about her favorite music, her childhood memories, and her dreams that had once felt too distant to share. It was strange, watching a man who once measured value in numbers, now measure it in moments. He no longer cared about market reports or quarterly earnings. He cared about the sound of her laughter, the way she described her mother's cooking, and the peace he found simply listening to her read under the olive trees. But it was during one of those quiet mornings, under the grey light of early spring, that he fell. A sudden collapse. No warning, just silence. I remember the way Sophia screamed his name, the panic in her voice as she knelt beside him, begging him to open his eyes. Paramedics arrived quickly, but time had done what it always does. It moved forward without asking permission. My grandfather survived the episode, but something in him changed. The strength he once wore like armor faded. His steps became slower, his voice weaker. And yet, in those fragile weeks, he smiled more than I'd ever seen. "Funny," he said one afternoon, looking out the window, "how it took me a lifetime to realize what matters. And now, I don't want to waste a single second of it." Sophia never left his side. She became his caregiver, not out of obligation, but out of love. She read to him, fed him, helped him dress. But more than that, she gave him comfort, not just of the body, but of the soul. One night, as I passed by his room, I heard him whisper, "Thank you for giving me a second chance." And her reply, soft and steady, was, "Thank you for taking it." He nodded, eyes closing slowly. "I wish I had more time." She held his hand. "You're making this time count. That's what matters now." It was a moment I'll never forget, not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. Two people, once separated by silence and shame, now bound by truth and time, and the courage to love anyway. The end came quietly, just as he had begun to live loudly for the first time. Early one morning, long before the sun rose, I heard Sophia call my name with a voice I had never heard from her before. Fragile, fractured. I rushed to his room and found her sitting beside him, her hand resting over his chest, still and calm. He was gone. No machines, no chaos, no final gasps, just peace. On his nightstand was the bracelet he had given her, now placed inside the same wooden box, along with one final letter. It was addressed to Sophia. She opened it with trembling hands, and as her eyes scanned the words, silent tears fell. "You gave me more than forgiveness," he had written. "You gave me the chance to become the man I should have always been." His funeral was unlike any I had ever seen. The guests who once saw him only as a business titan now saw him as something more, as a man who had broken, healed, and transformed. Sophia stood at the front, not behind the staff or hidden in the background. She wore a modest black dress and a quiet dignity that filled the room more than any speech could. When it was her turn to speak, she didn't recount pain or regrets. Instead, she shared a memory, the first time he held her hand in the garden and called her my daughter. It wasn't perfect, she said. It was late, but it was real, and sometimes real is enough. There wasn't a dry eye in the room, because they all understood. This wasn't just the story of a maid and a millionaire. It was the story of what it means to choose love, even when it costs everything. After the burial, Sophia didn't move back to the city. She stayed in the house, not as staff, but as the rightful heir to the legacy my grandfather had rewritten with his final years. The walls that once echoed with silence now echoed with music, laughter, and life. And in the garden, near the olive trees, where they had spent so many quiet mornings, she planted a small plaque that read, "For the years we lost and the love we found." I visit her often now. We sit on the old bench, talk about everything and nothing, and sometimes we just listen. Because in the silence, we hear him, not the man he was, but the father he became. And that's the version of him we choose to remember. Life after my grandfather's passing took on a rhythm of healing, one that moved slowly, but purposefully. Sophia inherited not only part of his estate, but something much more meaningful, a sense of belonging. She didn't change the mansion's grandeur or its ornate traditions overnight, but you could feel her touch everywhere. The portraits that once displayed only the patriarchs of the past now included a new frame, a photo of Sophia and my grandfather in the garden, side by side, smiling. It wasn't posed or planned. I had taken it on a whim one afternoon, and somehow it became the most honest portrait that house ever held. The girl who entered through the service door now stood at the center of a family history she was once hidden from. She didn't seek to erase the past. She honored it, even the parts that hurt. I remember walking into her room one evening, now the master suite, and seeing the wooden box still placed on the nightstand, beside a fresh bouquet of garden roses. Inside were all the letters from her mother, Elena, preserved like treasure. She was working on compiling them into a book, not for profit, but for memory. "If I ever have a daughter," she told me, "I want her to know that love is never wasted, even when it's buried." I asked if she ever resented him. She shook her head. "I used to. I blamed him for everything. But then I met the man he became. And I realized, sometimes the apology is the life they try to live after they fail you." That truth settled into me like a weight I didn't know I was carrying. And perhaps the most beautiful part of it all was this: Sophia didn't just forgive, she began to build. She reopened the foundation my grandfather had once created, but left dormant for years. Only now, it wasn't about legacy through power or prestige. It was about stories, hidden ones, forgotten ones. She began helping women in similar situations, daughters looking for fathers, families torn apart by secrets, people searching for roots they thought were lost forever. The mansion became more than a home. It became a place of restoration, a place where silence was no longer feared and truth was no longer hidden. My grandfather may have started his journey with denial, but Sophia ended it with light. And at the end, that was his real inheritance, not the wealth he left behind, but the love he finally allowed in. Years passed, but the memory of how everything changed never faded. Sophia grew into her role not just as a daughter, but as a leader, not of corporations, but of hearts. The mansion, once a symbol of wealth, became a haven for reconciliation. People came from all over, women searching for their fathers, sons estranged from their mothers, even siblings meeting for the first time. Sophia welcomed them all with humility and grace. She never pretended to have all the answers, but she knew what it meant to carry pain in silence. And more importantly, she knew how to walk others toward healing, not with speeches, but with presence, the same way my grandfather, in his final season, had learned to love her, not perfectly, but consistently, every year. On the anniversary of my grandfather's death, we gather under the olive trees in the garden. There's no ceremony, no headlines, just stories, stories of the man he was and the man he became. We read aloud a letter from the wooden box. Sometimes it's from Elena, sometimes from him. Each one is a thread in a tapestry of brokenness. mended by truth. One year, I asked Sophia if she regretted ever walking through the gates of that mansion. She smiled, eyes full of quiet strength. If I hadn't, she said, I'd still be wondering who I was. And he'd have died thinking love was just something he could buy. That sentence struck something deep in me, because it was true. The wealth that built the walls around that house was never enough to fill the void inside it. But love did what money never could. It opened doors. Now, Sophia mentors young women who grew up without fathers. She tells them her story, not to inspire pity, but to awaken hope. And I've seen what that story can do. I've watched tears turn into purpose, anger into action. She became more than a daughter. She became a mirror of possibility, proof that your beginning doesn't have to define your ending. And my grandfather, in the chapters of her life, he's no longer the man who disappeared. He's the man who returned, not in time to fix everything, but in time to change something. And sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that's everything. Because when the truth finally comes home, even a broken family can be made whole. One step, one word, one heartbeat at a time. One day, many years later, Sophia invited me to sit with her in the same garden where it had all begun. The place where my grandfather first reached for her hand, where silence turned into belonging. The sun was low, casting golden light over the olive leaves, and in that stillness, she shared something that felt like the final page of a long, beautiful book. You know, she said, gently running her fingers along the old bracelet he gave her. For a long time, I thought I was just a chapter in his redemption, but now I see. He was a chapter in mine too. I nodded, unable to speak, because it was true. The story wasn't just about a father rediscovering love. It was about a daughter choosing to believe that love, even when late, can still be worth receiving. She reached into her pocket and handed me a small photo. It was worn at the edges, a little faded, but unmistakable. Sophia, holding a newborn baby girl, standing beneath the olive tree where she and my grandfather had shared their final real conversation. Her name is Alina, she whispered. I wanted her to carry the name of the woman who gave me life, and the strength to walk into that house. I smiled through tears. In that moment, I realized something powerful. This wasn't the end of a story. It was the beginning of another. A generation born not out of secrecy or silence, but out of restoration and truth. That child would grow up not in the shadow of shame, but in the light of a legacy redefined by courage. And even now, as I write this, the house still stands, not as a monument to wealth, but as a home where truth was finally spoken aloud. The walls are softer somehow, the rooms brighter. Laughter echoes through the halls again, and when the wind moves through the garden, it's almost as if I can hear his voice, not the voice of a millionaire, but the voice of a father saying, I found my daughter. That one sentence changed everything, because in the end, it wasn't about who had money, who had power, or who made mistakes. It was about love, raw, unfiltered, unearned, the kind that arrives too late, but still on time. And that, I've learned, is the most powerful kind of all. And so, the story lives on, not trapped in dusty photo albums or whispered behind closed doors, but carried openly in the lives of those forever changed by it. Sophia became a symbol of what it means to reclaim identity, not from what the world tells you, but from the truth buried in your blood. Your memory, your courage to face what others hid. She never sought to become the heart of the family. Yet that's exactly what happened, because love, real love, doesn't demand power or attention. It quietly roots itself in presence, grows in truth, and flowers in moments no one else sees. Like when she sings to baby Alina by the same piano she once played alone. Like when she walks barefoot through the garden, whispering her mother's name. These moments are not grand, but they are sacred. The mansion became a living testimony, not just of wealth or lineage, but of what can happen when one person refuses to let silence define their destiny. Visitors often ask if the story they've heard is true, if the girl who once scrubbed floors really became the daughter of the man who built an empire. Sophia never answers directly. She just smiles and says, truth has a way of finding its place, and that is all she needs to say. Because those who truly listen, those who understand the weight of untold stories, feel the answer in the walls, in the garden, in the quiet echoes of forgiveness that still hang in the air. As for me, I continue to visit, not just to remember, but to witness. I see in Sophia a strength that no inheritance can buy. I see in her daughter the beginning of a new chapter, one written not in secrets, but in legacy. And I often think about my grandfather. I used to remember him as a stern, unreachable figure, always too busy for real connection. But now, I remember his hand trembling as he gave Sophia that bracelet. I remember his voice breaking when he called her my daughter. I remember the man who dared to change before it was too late. And in a world that so often defines people by their worst moments, I choose to remember him by his bravest one, the day he opened his heart, and everything changed. Years from now, when little Elena is old enough to ask about her grandfather, the man in the framed photo with the kind eyes and the weathered hands, Sophia will tell her the truth. Not a fairy tale, not a sanitized version of events, but the real story. She speak of mistakes made, letters unread, time lost, but she also speak of transformation, of redemption chosen when it mattered most, and of a love that refused to stay buried. And when Elena asks why he gave her mother a bracelet instead of an apology, Sophia will smile and say, because sometimes love speaks loudest when words fail. That bracelet, still resting on her wrist, will be passed down one day, not because of its silver or the name engraved on it, but because of the history it carries, of pain healed and love reclaimed. The staff that once whispered in the hallways now speak openly with warmth in their voices. Many of them stayed, not because of duty, but because the house no longer felt like a fortress. It felt like home. Sophia never tried to erase their memories of what the mansion used to be. She simply created new ones, community dinners in the grand hall, music drifting through the corridors, a child's laughter echoing where silence once reigned. In every corner of the estate, there is a trace of her story, quiet but undeniable. A maid's room turned nursery, a study once locked, now filled with light, a library table where letters are no longer hidden but read aloud. She didn't take over the house, she redefined it, and I too carry this story, not just as a witness, but as someone forever changed by it. I once thought legacy was built in marble and money. I believed family was written in legal names and formal dinners, but now I understand. Legacy is built in the choices we make when it would be easier to walk away. It's written in the courage to come back when the door has long been closed. My grandfather left behind many things, stocks, properties, possessions. But the greatest thing he left was the chance to make things right. And Sophia, she took that chance, not to gain status, but to give healing. In doing so, she became more than just a daughter. She became the heartbeat of a family once broken, and the reason it still moves forward. Now, as I look back on everything, the silence, the revelations, the tears, the second chances, I realize that this story was never just about a hidden daughter or a wealthy man with regrets. It was about what happens when truth finally finds a voice, when love, though late, dares to show up, when pain, instead of being buried, is held gently and transformed into something beautiful. My grandfather's mansion once stood as a monument to a life carefully constructed, meticulously controlled. But in the end, the greatest thing he ever built wasn't made of stone or steel. It was a bridge, one that spanned over decades of silence, across oceans of shame, and into the arms of a daughter he had once lost. Today, the legacy he left behind isn't measured by the size of his bank accounts or the names engraved on brass plaques. It's measured in the way Sophia teaches her daughter to forgive without losing her strength. In the way she opens the doors of that house to those who were told they didn't belong. In the way she walks through rooms once haunted by secrets, not as a stranger, but as a woman who turned those secrets into seeds. And now those seeds bloom, every season, in every room. Because when someone chooses to break a cycle of silence, they don't just rewrite their story, they rewrite everyone's. And so, this is the story I carry. This is the memory I guard, not because it's perfect, but because it's real. A story where love was denied, then rediscovered, where family wasn't defined by DNA alone, but by the courage to claim each other, where a maid became a daughter, and a millionaire became a man. And if you're wondering what became of Sophia now, she's still there, still tending the garden, still reading old letters, still choosing to believe that love, even when hidden, never disappears. It waits, it watches, and when the moment is right, it returns. Not always in the way we expect, but always in the way we need. Sometimes I sit alone in the garden, long after the sun has gone down, listening to the sounds of that house breathing. There's something sacred in the quiet, a kind of stillness that doesn't feel empty, but full of memories, full of voices that once trembled to be heard. I imagine my grandfather there beside me, no longer the rigid figure who ruled from behind oak doors, but the version of him I knew at the end, humble, softened, present. I think about the moment his hand first touched Sophia's, about the way he whispered my daughter like a prayer, asking for one last chance. And then I think about what that chance became, not a moment, but a movement, a legacy not of wealth, but of restoration. It amazes me how something so simple, the hiring of a maid, could unfold into something so profound. Had she not come to that house, had she not carried her mother's letters, had she not dared to look into the eyes of the man who abandoned her, none of this would have happened. We would have all stayed locked in the safety of what we thought was truth. But she knocked at the door. She stood in silence, waited, endured the stares, the assumptions, the long nights of wondering if she would ever be seen, and she was. Not immediately, not easily, but fully, and in being seen, she taught us all something we hadn't learned in decades, that family isn't about pretending everything is fine, it's about choosing to love anyway. There's a bench now, under the olive tree where it all began, polished, carved with one simple inscription. She was just the maid. Until we listened. Tourists sometimes ask what it means. Some think it's poetic, others think it's strange. But those of us who know, we understand. It means the past can hurt, but it doesn't have to define us. It means people can change, even late in life. It means that redemption isn't just possible, it's powerful. And if you ever find yourself lost, silenced, or buried beneath the weight of someone else's choices, remember Sophia, remember her story. And remember, sometimes, the person who enters quietly is the one who carries the truth loud, enough to change everything. That if there's one thing this story taught me more than any inheritance, more than any revelation, it's this: we don't get to choose how we start, but we do get to choose how we continue. Sophia walked into that mansion with nothing but a bag, a name, and a letter from a mother long gone. She left with a family, a purpose, and a future that once felt impossible. Not because she demanded it, but because she lived it, with dignity, patience, and the quiet strength to let love arrive in its own time. And when it did, it didn't come wrapped in apologies or grandeur. It came in garden walks, in piano melodies, in trembling hands reaching across the decades. It came in presence, and presence, I've learned, is the most radical act of love we have. My grandfather, for all his faults, gave her that in the end, and in doing so, gave himself something even rarer: peace. Not the kind that comes from a bank statement or a reputation polished by years of power, but the kind that settles in the soul when you stop running from the truth, when you turn around, look it in the eyes, and say, "I'm here now." That's what he did, and that's why his final years weren't tragic. They were triumphant, because he chose to come home, not to a place, but to a person, and that made all the difference. Now, whenever I see Sophia with her daughter, I see a future rooted not in wealth, but in wisdom. A child growing up in a house that once hid pain, now flooded with light. A legacy rewritten not by power, but by presence. And I think to myself, maybe that's all any of us really need: a chance, a choice, and someone brave enough to knock on the door with nothing to offer but the truth. Sophia did that. And in doing so, she reminded all of us that no matter how broken the past, love, when chosen, can still rewrite the ending, one heart at a time. And so we reach the final page of a story that was never meant to be a secret, but somehow was. A story of silence, turned into song, of a man once afraid of the truth, learning in the end that the only thing more powerful than regret is redemption. My grandfather didn't leave this world perfect. He didn't erase the years lost or undo the pain he once caused, but he did something greater. He faced it. He let himself be broken in front of the daughter he never held, and then allowed her to hold him when he no longer had strength to stand on his own. That is what love looks like when it grows out of ashes. It doesn't always come wrapped in fairy tales. Sometimes it walks in through the back door, wearing a maid's uniform, carrying a letter, and waiting for someone to finally listen. And now, every time I walk those familiar halls, I don't see a mansion. I see a memory, a promise, a living echo of what happens when we choose to open our hearts, even after we've closed them for too long. Sophia's daughter plays in the same garden where truths were once buried. She runs under the trees, carefree, unburdened by the weight of what came before her, because someone was brave enough to dig up the past, to face the storm, and to plant something new. That little girl will grow up knowing not just her family name, but her family's truth. And in that truth, she will find strength, the kind passed down not through blood, but through healing. So if you take anything from this story, let it be this: it's never too late to say, I see you. Never too late to reach for a hand you once let go. Never too late to become the person you were too afraid to be. And never ever too late to love. Because in the end, that's all that remains. Not the fortune, not the silence, not the secrets, just the love we dared to give, and the courage it took to receive it. And that changes everything.